All right, guys, let's talk trolling. It is a trolling masterclass. We're going to get you dialed in on all things trolling. First and foremost, we got to start with the baits. It's always with the baits, and there's so many neat baits in trolling, but we need to really work on dissecting what makes a trolling bait different from others, right? So you can troll pretty much any bait. You can troll bulldog, you can troll bucktails, anything that's not going to blow out of the water, you can drag behind your boat. But there's some different categories. So the way I like to break down trolling baits is pretty simple, right? So we're going to have shallow, mid, and deep, right? And some baits fall into both categories or all categories based on some adjustments. So I'm going to work with just starting with the shallow stuff. Some of your most common baits they're trolled quite often are just minnow style baits, right? So something as classic as like a super shad wrap, shallow invaders troll very well. They're going to fall into that category where if you look at the lips, not a superbly aggressive lip, not a very big bait. So they're going to be in that 1 to, let's say 4 or 5 feet zone without any augmentation, you know? And then we go into baits typically, and you can kind of judge them off of this, mid-depth baits, like a depth raider, or I consider most of the supernatural baits to be mid-depth baits. We're really not using these baits very often to get in excess of 10, 12 feet as mid-depth, okay? So just for a basic point of example here, and, you know, we go to some of the truly deep stuff. There's very few baits that really go deep, quote-unquote, deep, right? And in some bodies of water you might fish, these might hit the very bottom of your lake. A bait like a big fork reef digger. These baits actually are really going to get down past that 12 to that 15-foot zone quite easily. You know, a newcomer in the musky game that actually has a bait that goes quite deep is the Ivan Lures. This is the switchblade, which has an adjustable lip, and this bait easily achieves 30 feet, right? Then you have like your slammer deep. So you can really start breaking apart your trolling baits, or should break apart your trolling baits and categorize them as shallow, mid, and deep, right? The reason to do this is as we advance through this and we talk about trolling, there's going to be decisions you have to make, right? And one of the main decisions I want to look at when trolling is the dynamic between line length, right, and depth. So how much line do I need to hit my target depth? Now, why that's important and why it matters, you know, I'm trying to minimize the way I troll. I want minimum line for my target depth, right? So the reason I want the minimum amount of line out to reach my target depth boils down to control. So I'm going to start with control of your lures and your boat, and then we'll work back towards these baits and show the application standpoint, right? So first and foremost, people always ask, when it comes to trolling, how do I know how deep my baits are running, right? How do I know that my let's grab this, you know, my big 12-inch headlock, how do I know how deep it's running? Or my Ivan bait, or a slammer, or a depth raider? Well, the Musky 360 app, which is free, you can download it off the App Store, has trolling charts for most of all the popular big musky baits. Some old vintage baits are on there, and it's going to give you the dynamic, right, of how we achieve depth with baits, which is speed, line length equals depth, right? So our speed and our certain line length determines what depth that our baits are running at. So we can rely on an app like Musky 360 that's going to have all the trolling charts there. I'm sure Jay's showing one right now. So we have the trolling charts at Musky 360 that are going to break that down for you. This speed range with this length of line equals this depth. And what happens is it creates a repeatable scenario, okay? So I don't want you to conceptualize trolling as this act where we're just driving around the boat willy-nilly. We hit a fish or we don't, right? We catch one, we don't. That's not what's happening with trolling. What trolling really boils down to is finding that target depth. So, for example, here's Mr. Musky. You can buy these magnets at the Musky Shop. They're wonderful. Stole it off my wife's fridge, folks. So, let's say we have Mr. Musky here. And much like we'll pretend this is our depth finder, right? You'll kind of usually have your sidebar here and pretend we got 0, we got 5, we got 10, we got 15, 20, 25, whatever, right? So here's the water. Our boat's underwater right now. Let's get that out of there. So here's our boat. And we've used seasonality, right? And structure. And we're going to have a seminar in the Musky Shop about seasonality and about structure this year. But we're going to look at seasonality. So we know Mr. Musky is down here at about, 15. We're splitting the difference. Mr. Musky's somewhere in this band between 15 and 20 on our sounder. Let's say that mark came in at 17. Okay? We need to get a bait above the fish. Now, first and foremost, when it comes to trolling, right? If our bait is here, here's a crankbait that's as big. This is the worst crankbait a human being's ever drawn, but we're trying to go faster. If our bait is below the fish, he's not going to feel or see that bait, right? So our bait needs to be running above the fish. So if he's at 17, I'm thinking in this band here. Now, on occasion, muskies will run up to the surface. There's no doubt. You could run a bait at 2 feet down. If this muskie is highly aggressive, he'll come up. In most situations, right, bluebird days, post-frontal, cold weather, it's rare that a muskie is going to make a gigantic move from the bottom up quite a distance, right? It happens, and it happens quite often, but this is not something I'm going to count on. The reason being, if I'm fully aware and I've done my patterning, and I know seasonally that muskies are right now, so we got another guy here, wow, this guy's as big as the boat. Wonderful. I want him. So we've got fish that are kind of in this band, right? This is our cutoff of where fish are staged. From a trolling aspect, we want a bait that's going to run above them that's seasonally appropriate, right? So that creates some of those dynamics and why the trolling charts are so important. So let's say, 10-inch headlock. We know that we can get a 10-inch headlock in this 12 zone pretty easy, right? And you can look at your trolling charts on Musky 360. Now we know we can run this bait over muskies that are holding at this depth in a repeatable fashion. And it's such a depth that we're going to have their attention because muskies feed forward and up, right? Right? They follow a bait and they recoil, but muskies are looking for things over them and they hit them vibrationally. So what I'm looking for is to pattern them seasonally, use my electronics to gauge where our target line is and troll above that, right? I'm not going to come here and go and run like a reef digger or a Smitty deep or something like that and try to hit them dead on, right? We don't want to do that. We don't want to run that bait there. We want to run slightly above them, right? So 12, 13 foot zone for a fish at 17, a 4 foot long fish, that's the distance between. So I'm trying to look at the dynamic between where the fish is staged in the water column and where my baits need to be running, right? So if that fish, like I said, we'll keep him there at 17. If it was high, bright sun, dead, flat, calm, light penetration, right? So the angle of the sun is actually going to come in here and create kind of this no zone, a bunch of X's here. Right, so the sunlight is going to penetrate here, depending on its angle, right? Where visually, it's hard for a muskie to see. So we don't want to be here, but we want to be below the level of light penetration on any given day, right? And what I mean by that, everyone says muskies eat best in the morning and the evening. Well, because the light penetration is the lowest, they have better visual acumen and they tend to feed shallower the later or the lower the light conditions are. And a lot of muskies been caught in cloudy days. I'll save that for another day, but do the math at home yourself and go, oh, low light penetration means shallower feeding fish. On days that are tough, when light penetration is greater, right, it can go down 5, 6, 7, 8 feet. Say there's kind of this line where we know light is penetrating in the water column based on water clarity, wind chop, and things of that nature. We've now really narrowed our band of our target zone. Okay, so we've been able to narrow this down from baits that are running somewhere in that 10 to 15 zone for fish that are staged at 17. And now we really have a clear vision or a clear trajectory of where we want to go as far as baits and presentations, okay? So you've got to take in consideration a lot of factors. There's tons of stuff to kind of cover and think about, not only be it the day's weather, seasonality, light penetration, fishing pressure, things of that nature. Okay, so using trolling charts can quickly help us eliminate a lot of baits, right? So let's look at some common baits, right? A grandma, and I'll grab a depth raider just for example, right? So we've got the Spanky M9 grandma and a depth raider, right? Size-wise, okay, to a fish, that's not a huge difference, right? 8-inch bait, 9-inch bait, somewhere in that neighborhood. But their applications are going to be entirely different. Where this bait I'm typically running, you know, this is a shallower running bait opposed to a depth raider with a more aggressive bill is going to get down here. So what I'm getting at is once you know a target zone and you look at the trolling charts on the Musky 360 app and you look at the line distance, right? So line distance versus the needed or your target running depth, it can help you narrow it down. So back to this, if we know Mr. Musky's here, let's even move him up. Let's move him here. Call that 12. Right, so he's at 12. We know that we need to be looking for baits that are running above him. So call this 8. We can look at our trolling charts and have a pretty good idea if baits are going to hit the target depth. Most baits actually will, where, you know, it could be your headlock, it could be your depth rate, it could be your grandma that are going to be valuable there. Moving him back down to here narrows the band. And the way I like to look at trolling baits, right, is kind of this thing. Depth, options. So, you know, it's a decline. It's actually reverse of that, where the deeper I go, the options dwindle, but you get what I'm saying. So the deeper I want to get, my options are limited. Any bait you have in your tackle box or you have anywhere is going to be effective here. Top waters, glide baits, it doesn't matter. If it is 5 feet or below and conditions are right, they're practically all effective. You can flatline troll a spinner bait. You can troll a standard bucktail. There's just about no bait that's not effective here. So, you know, all baits effective. I'm a musky guide, not a professional rider, okay? My apologies. So in this 5 foot to 0 range, all baits are effective, not at all times. Nothing's effective all the time, but they are all theoretically effective. So a top water at times could be effective as a trolling presentation, bucktails, you name it, right? The biggest band of trolling baits, let's just call that magic 12 here, right? Is this 12 number. You have a high percentage of trolling baits that are built for that zone, right? When we get past this, when we get past 12 feet, there's very few options. So break your baits down and look at what is effective in each zone and what the potentials are, right? So what I'm getting at is categorize your baits, learn their running depths. Whether you learn them on the water, you just look at the 360 app and look at our trolling charts, you can go, okay, this bait is going to be ineffective if fish are outside this band. So all baits are effective. There's a high percentage of trolling baits that will hit this. After that, you're out of the shooting match. So you're just basically narrowing that band because we all have to make decisions on the water as to what bait to use when trolling. Okay? So we look at that and we go, well, what baits do I use? Right? If we've determined our target depth, let's go back to that 12 number, right? Mr. Musky's lurking here. He's whatever. 12 is the magic number today. We look at our trolling selection and we realize what baits we can have that really effectively hit kind of that 10 feet, 2 feet above him, kind of this band, you know, 9 to 10, where I'd like to run the bait above him and get him to look at it. We can break that down and then start comparing actions, okay? So that's where it gets tricky, where seasonality, and this is a broad generalization, seasonality now comes into play when I'm looking at bait selection. Okay, so we have the cycle here. Let's go spawn, right? So here we have some muskie spawn. And their life cycle starts at the spawn in my mind and comes back to the spawn, right? So this is spring, summer, fall, winter. And there's a same circle here of small, medium, right? Med, large, and jumbo, right? And this is a loose rule of thumb, but as we start at the spawn in casting, we all know you don't want to come out swinging double tens right after the spawn. So we're going to start in the spring with small baits, and as we creep onto the summer, there's plenty of changes. We get a small, medium presentation in the summer. We move into the fall, it's large baits and right, your typical things. We get into the late fall, which is like a middle point. And there's a lot of midpoints in this, but you know, between the fall and the winter, that's the late season. We're fishing big suckers. We're fishing big trolling baits. We're fishing, you know, tons of these different baits that are in the big section. And in the winter, we go to the jumbo. So we can look at seasonality as a guideline for trolling bait size, right? And then begin to compare action. So back to the baits. 10-inch headlock, 9-inch grandma. You know, people will often compare size and profile. Generally the same size. You could fool a muskie into eating a 10-inch or a 9-inch bait. It's really not going to be that big of a deal, right? Slightly bigger profile, but in gross generalities, same size class. We start comparing and paying attention to the action of the bait. So a bait like a headlock, what Supernatural is known for, is a wide wander. It has a pin system here. This pin system opens the baits up and allows this bait to walk side to side. It's a very aggressive bait, right? Jay's got tons of underwater footage to show you of headlocks in action, where that bait will walk side to side on the troll. In comparison to a bait like a grandma, it's a tighter action, right? Little more subtle. It's got plenty of action to it, but it's a more tight, straight retrieve with a tighter wobble, right? So it's not walking quite as much, and it's less aggressive. And it's not a comparison of good or bad. This is a less aggressive bait than this. So what am I looking at seasonality-wise, right? Well, as we get into that circle again, right? Seasonality. So we come around here in this circle of, for me, in the spring, it's like a less aggressive thing, trolling. We get into the summer, we're getting more, and then we go back to less aggressive, right? It's a really loose rule of thumb. That's not the end-all, be-all, but it is something to consider, where muskies that are lethargic due to water temperature, due to the seasonality, are going to be less apt to go and chase down baits that are heavily walking and going crazy. Now, with that being said, there's been some monstrous muskies caught right on season opener with Supernatural big baits, right? And there's also been a lot of big muskies caught on grandmas. So I'm giving you a very loose rule of thumb of where to start action-wise. So action's something you're going to have to figure out every day on the water. But if we are already dialed in on the depth, our target zone, right, wherever that might fall in this category, that will help us narrow it down. So again, like I said, you're going to have that slice, that high percentage here of quote unquote trolling baits that are going to run here, where you're going to have a lot of decisions to make bait wise in this mid band zone, right? You got a ton of decisions to make up here, but you know, we'll talk about that in a second. Most of the time, it's going to be your blades, spinner baits, and your minnow baits. But you're going to have a high percentage of baits to break down here. And the easiest way to do that is looking at your trolling charts, figuring out what baits hit your target depth, and work on the dichotomy of action. So the best way to do that is going to be compare them on the water, right? So some states, depending on where you're at, some places only allow you one line, right? So if you have two anglers in the boat, it might be incumbent on you, say that we know muskies are ticking around here at 8, Mr. Muskies are running here at 8. Yeah, we might want to try, say, a Supernatural big bait and a grandma, or maybe a B&N claw, you know, whatever kind of minnow bait, and compare the action, right? So a lot of times that straighter action, that tighter wobble is going to entice a strike where that wider wobble. Like I said, take in consideration seasonality, take in consideration also the climactic factors at that time. I tend to find that when we're high bright sun post frontal, that tighter action, right? And it's not just a grandma thing. It is, you could compare, even say, this is a large tough shad. It's got some wonder, it's got a knocker and a really, really fast, wide action like this, where that has at its appropriate time, but going to say something that's a slightly more subtle, but still a really nice action, like a Squeaky Pete from Livingston. Once again, kind of that classic, I call these flat-setted minnow baits or stick baits. That classic action might be a little bit better. So we got to compare on a daily basis. Again, my point about seasonality, I'm not going to come out in the spring at the beginning of kind of that circle I made with you, right? Do it again here. I'm not going to start here at the spawn. I'm not going to start headed this direction with highly aggressive baits. I'm going to wait till kind of that peak summer into the winter before I kind of slice the pie that way. So for me, it's like subtle over here and heavy action, right? Heavy action here. So I'm going to be more subtle on this slice of the pie and a little more heavy action on that other side until we get into winter. But that is a dynamic you're going to have to look at, right? Also, too, something that's going to play is going to be the size class of the fish you're targeting. You know, a muskie of any size, a 30-inch muskie will hit a 10-inch bait, but it's not something that's going to happen every day. So you also need to take in consideration size class where, you know, you might be best off shad wraps, lunging lures, things of that nature, kind of more downsized options, right? You could actually look at this, go shallow bait and a mid bait. So we want to take seasonality, size class of our water into consideration, and then factor in that action, you know, into our equation. And that's really the big thing we need to look at. So there's no hard, fast rule. There's absolutely no hard, fast rule on this bait during this time of year, or, you know, at this speed. So these are things you're going to have to play with on the water each and every time you're out and you're trying to troll. You're going to have to break down that dynamic, you know. So once again, we're looking for line, length, speed, target depth. You can figure this out from the app, and you can play with this on a sliding scale with your throttle, and this is going to come from, you know, your electronics plus seasonality. Those are the dynamics you need to look at. So I know I can put out X amount of line at this target speed in that kind of a sliding scale, right? But our target depth is going to be electronics and seasonality. So to the point of electronics, how can we rely on electronics to solve the same problem? I just kind of did this sliding scale here, this graph thing, right? Let's do this one more time here. 0, 5, 10, 15, 20. So we have our water line. Why not? Makes it funner. So we have this target depth, but there's no muskies present. We can't see, right? We don't have the latest and the greatest electronics. We don't have crazy stuff. We have downscan. On occasion, you'll see a muskie on downscan, but not something that you got to pretty much be right over top of them. But if we can find bait fish, we can kind of assess the situation the same way. Now, it's a pretty good rule of thumb, and I'm going to make it's going to look messy. I apologize. Let's say, you know, you'll see them on the graph. Here's your cloud, right? This ain't pretty. It looks like a squished meatball, but bear with me, right? So here's a little bait fish cloud. Here's some smaller fish predating on this, right? Using your electronics, if you're seeing bait fish kind of in this zone, right? Well, if predator or predatory fish are feeding an upward manner on this, we know that we need to probably be running our bait at that level, right? Slightly below that level or at that level, okay? Now, that same thing, my ugly little bait school there, right? The same problem exists here. If you draw, you know, here's your graph cloud and all this crap, you see a bunch of kind of balled up, maybe a few little walleyes picked them off. We have the same dynamic where we need to be here. So we want to be on par or slightly below, because in most situations, muskies are going to be hanging out here, right? So if we're looking at, say, small bait fish, the muskie's going to be below that school, picking off fish that are that are predating slightly above and into this school and exiting on the outside of it, right? So we can use that as a good rule of thumb if we're not seeing muskies but we're seeing bait fish, of where to target, right? So muskies are not going to be found very often. On occasion, they'll stage in advance of things. But back to this, here's your bait school, right? It would be highly unlikely that he's up here, right? Not an actively feeding muskie. If we've got, your little marks here, people have seen it. Here's the stupid bait school, and you're seeing those arches on your screen. If we have these arches coming up and they're predating on this bait school, he's going to be an actively feeding muskie, like I said, on par with or under in most circumstances. So if you're not able to mark muskies, you're in a lake that's populated enough, you can use bait clouds as a context clue. Now you can also use schooling fish, right? And these little arches are just representing arches, right? So arches you'd see on your graph, right? We got these, that same kind of data, that same kind of return on your fish finder. Let's say this is bottom, all right? And we're seeing this. We're driving. That's telling me that we can eliminate this, right? Right? And if they're kind of here, we kind of had this mark here. We can eliminate this. Now we have this band to work through. Now it's still a 10-foot band of what I just kind of scribbled when I wasn't planning it, but we got a 10-foot band here between 10 and 20 that we got to work with. A logical thing would be if muskies are feeding down and up, right, most of the time, I might want to be somewhere in this mid kind of zone, right? Running my bait about there on that 12 mark, right? So you can use bait fish and the marks on your down scan as a pretty solid starting point to determine the appropriate running depth, right? So again, that helps figure out what to use, right? Because the question is, what trolling bait do I use? What bait is effective? It's not that there's one bait that's more effective than any other. It's not that any class of trolling bait, they're all pretty much crankbaits, but not that one class of trolling bait is going to outshine another, right? So what we want to do is use the context clues that we have to make that determination. So back to it, break your baits down. Shallow, mid, deep. Categorize your baits. Categorize all of your musky baits you intend to troll with, so you understand where they're most effective. Now, that what you can tell, it would be less, and it's not that you can't do it. I could take this shallow invader, right? Great bait, great casting bait, great trolling bait. I could take this shallow invader and force it to run, down here in 10, 12 feet by using, vertical planers, additional weighting, and things of that nature. What I'm going for, back to the original point here, which is ease of use, right? So categorize your baits as far as what baits are going to allow you to do that, and you will find that's all high percentage and very few. I can only think of very few tools that are going to allow you to do the deep thing, right? But back to that categorization. So kind of broke down how to pick a bait based on the rough generalities of seasonality. Why do I want to keep my line short? And what I was getting at, and we mentioned earlier, I'm looking for a bait to hit my target depth, right, with the shortest amount of line that's seasonally appropriate. We'll get up. This is kind of overhead boat, right? So he's you're top down on this guy, right? So if I'm looking at this scenario, or a new scenario here, right? Let's say here's I'm going to draw a shoreline here. It's kind of, he's got some fingers coming out, right? Here's shoreline. Pretend you're looking at your map. And so here's, you know, small breaks. I'll just kind of dotted line the breaks just to make sense here. Right, here's the break 1, break 2. So those are kind of your graph break lines. And let's say that this is, obviously this is 0, 4, make up a number, 8, 12. So if this is Mr. Boat and we're out here trolling, we're going to look at this point, right? That's kind of the main feature in this little deal here that we're looking at. So let's say we've established, because of our down scan or whatever, we've established that there are bait fish between 12 and 8. Now we know they're there, right, in that zone. So I'm eliminating this. I'm eliminating this, but I've got to contend with a pretty dang good contour right there. I could theoretically take, again, a shallow raider, a slammer, whatever. I could force them to hit this target zone, but it's going to take me a tremendous amount of line. So the longer my line is as I'm trolling, I end up having less control, right? So if I have a really long line, and here comes the boat, right? Let's say I have theoretically 100 feet out of the line, and I have to hit that kind of 8 to 12, this mid break. This is my target, right? That's my target zone at the end of that point. If I have a tremendous amount of line, I come through, and let's say I have 100 feet of line out. I kind of work this break and I come through. I could be effective here, but to make this turn and complete through that break line and contour it, my baits are now not doing what they should be. I have to turn my boat, my turning radius of my boat to contour this point, right, is greater, or excuse me, not the turning radius, the turning radius of my bait is too great. So if I'm coming here on a short line, right, here's a rod, here's a line, it's 20 feet, that path of travel, pretend that line's following me, that path of travel is like this, right? It's going to continue with me as I can make a tight turn here, all right? So what we want to do is break down our baits in a manner that allows us to have the utmost control, okay? So the longer the line, say the bait's going this way, here's line out 1, line 2, right? Let's say it's 100 feet, that's 20. If our target zip, this is hitting 8 feet, and this is hitting 8 feet. At that point in time, this bait is far more controllable than this bait, right? So as we advance 20 feet, if I were to turn on this bait, obviously on the outside turn he'll dig in, but it's far more responsive. It takes 100 feet, if you will, of turning or advancement to engage that bait. So if I turn, that bait is basically losing its action, right? It's still advancing a little bit, but it's lost its triggering properties quite often. So what I want you to do, or what I focus on, I'd recommend doing, is the shortest line to target depth. Shortest line to target depth. By doing so, that's going to allow you the boat control that we need to trigger fish. Okay, so if I know, again, let's just arbitrary number, 7 feet, whatever. 7 feet's the number. So I need to hit 7 feet. A lot of baits can do that. I'm going to look at that dynamic of hitting 7 feet. What baits? So line length. I'm looking at that too. Size for seasonality. Action. So if I need to hit this 7 feet mark whenever, doesn't mean the seasonality, I need to consider shortest amount of line, right? Is it appropriate size and profile for the seasonality? And then the action. And so when we're selecting our baits, that becomes some of the dynamic where one needs to, again, compare baits. So, you know, if we're dealing with 8-inch baits, go back to this. Let's go with another, I'll just grab a grandma here. You know, or 9-inch gray. You know, this Rachel is going to have a wider wobble. It will definitely hit 7 feet. Right? I probably did inches, but 7 feet. This grandma, excuse me, this Rachel will definitely hit 7 feet. But is it worth the little bit extra line to hit 7 feet on this grandma because it has a tighter wobble? So we're going to compare seasonality. So we need the right action at the shortest amount of line, which becomes, again, that boat control issue. Right? So break your baits down, and again, understand where they are applicable. Look at the trolling charts. Something I tell anglers all the time. If we're going to buy trolling baits, right, don't go and buy trolling baits because they look cool, right? Some of them look awesome. Most of them look awesome, and I'm guilty of just buying trolling baits because they look awesome. Purchase your trolling baits and make sure they're appropriate for the topography, the structure of the lake you're fishing, right? It does you no good if you're in a basin where, you know, it's no more than, your max depth is 12 feet. You don't need a big fork reef digger, right? But if you're fishing open water and big, heavy, deep structure, 20 feet, 15 feet, and you're targeting fish in those zones, that would be appropriate. So that makes it easy, because I think it can be overwhelming where every bait's a trolling bait. Not every bait, not all these, you know. Every bait could be casted, but I dare you, try, right? You can't cast that guy. You know, it'd take a gorilla. Here's the big slammer, right? It'd take a gorilla to cast this. So every casting bait is a trolling bait, but not every trolling bait is a casting bait. And so we need to look at that, because a lot of these baits take a lot of action. So you can break your baits down once or re-at the point. The dynamic between the length of line and the running depth. So to triggering, why that is so important. Why is that so important to us? All right? Why is it so important? So I'll go top down. Let's just do a little, let's just say this is kind of the crown of a point, right? It looks like a hump, but if this was 3D, and we have, the Musky Shop does not have like Jurassic Park budget, I promise you that. So imagine that's the end of a point, and we believe Mr. Musky's sitting here, right? So if we're trolling along here and we're trying to target this guy, we can all agree that when we cast to fish that they follow, right? Casting a bucktail, casting a topwater, we will often get a follow from a muskie where that fish comes in, he checks out the bait. Well, guess where we catch quite a lot of following fish? In the turn of the figure 8, right? So we want in a casting scenario, we want our leader to the rod tip, and we want this big, wide loping turn. There's thousands of catches, thousands of videos of muskies eating on that outside turn of a figure 8. So a short line to me is so important. So let's say I'm trolling along this guy, right? And here I go, here's the baits, you know, the bait's about here. We go past this bad dude. Well, if I keep my bait in my boat in a straight line, well, my bait's straight, and guess what's going to happen? We're going to get follows. You'll never see them, but it happens, right? So the reason I want to run a short line to keep this guy from following is if I encounter, say, the top of this point, you can call it a hump, but whatever. It's in my brain, it's like, okay, the point in the three-dimensional thing. If I'm coming over the top of this point and I've ran by him, right? Let's say we're up here, and now here's the bait, and he's come off the top of that point and he's following me. We can go yards. We could probably go 100 yards if that bait does not change things up, right? So if I have baits that are at the shortest line at my appropriate running depth with the right action, right size for seasonality, that is going to allow me to make some aggressive moves. Now, I've done it in other videos for Musky Shop, and you can see it. Jay put in some of the turning videos right now, but we'll do it a long ways here, right? So Mr. Musky's following. A line here, whatever. You know, as he's following, if I turn here, so the boat's going this way, right? Our direction is this way. And Mr. Musky's following our bait here. When I turn here and he's on this bait, that bait will actually float up, right? It's going to float up, but on a shorter line, I'm still advancing, and there's less of a angular nature of it. Because on the longer line, when I turn here, right, I start turning here, it's not as affected as soon, if you will, on the turn. I have to overcome the lope of the line, if you will, for lack of a better terminology. So as I turn here, right, the line is slackened somewhat on the inside, and I engage it quicker so that bait is following with me. Whereas on the outside, on this rod, this bait is actually digging in harder when I turn that direction, right? So when I turn this way, this one is up, this one is down. So the shorter line allows that bait to retain a little bit more action, right? So this bait is down, this bait is up, and you can reverse that if we're headed the other direction, right? So this is a rod, it's a bait. If I turn this direction, right, this bait is going up, this bait is going down. So the outside turn is digging in and going deeper. The inside turn is actually coming up and slowing the action. Now, what makes that interesting? Why is that important? Why is a shorter line important when we hit structure and cover? Well, Mr. Muskie's following us, and we all know that they'll follow a bait forever and not eat it. Now we have the opportunity to mix things up. So as I make that turn, and this bait comes up a little bit, and he's following right on, it's evading. It's coming up in your figure eight. Boom, they come up, right? The same thing, the net positive can happen here when this rod is going down. Let's say he's following this one, and I make that turn. That bait starts plunging down. It gets a little more aggressive. It speeds up, right? So the reason this one comes up and this one goes down, this is slowing, and this is speeding up due to the nature of the turn. Right? So there's more force exerted here. This one goes up, speeds up, and it digs in more. This one floats up. So now we're triggering fish, right? Most of my muskie catches when trolling come while turning, juking, or jiving, okay? And that's a lot of spit in there, but most of my strikes occur when I change things up, just like casting, right? The effectiveness of casting is adding in those slack line twitches you've heard Booker talk about for years, or ripping rubber and pulsing, or giving your glide bait the side to side in a pulse. You're mixing up the cadence. We have to mix up our cadence while trolling. So what I find to be super important, let's do it top down this way, is knowing when to do this, right? So we can turn our wheel, right? The ways we can add action trolling. Let me write this down. Add action trolling. We can turn. We just talked about that. So one bait will go up, one will go down. Maybe you're trolling one rod. It doesn't matter. It will augment how the baits are going. We can turn. Right? Number two, we can stall out, or slow down, I should say. Slow. Three, we can speed up. All we have at our disposal, realistically, is we have our throttle, right? We got throttle, whether it's a hand tilt or a shifter, and we have a steering wheel. That's it, right? So your throttle is your reeling speed, right? That's your speed of advancement. And we're going to articulate our baits. The wheel or the arm of your troll or your motor becomes the rod. So we're articulating with changing directions and augmenting speed with our speed control. So we can turn, slow down, speed up. That's pretty much the gist. We can jerk troll, we'll get to that. But those are kind of the main elements. So, with that in mind, how can we trigger more fish? So let's go here. Here's another shoreline coming out here. We'll just do another kind of pointy thing, blah, 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 and then another one. As we come down this line, and here's our theoretical breaks, blah, 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 blah. So we come down this line. Obviously, we're going to have to contour with this, right? But we can actually do some interesting things when, say, we're coming here. We're advancing forward, and we come past this break or a point that looks good. You can start making this turn, and you can dig in and then stall out on the end of points, right? So we could dig in and change our speed slightly in the turn, right? And then back things down as we come around here, and then do this again, and then do this again, and then do this again, right? That can create some interesting things, right? Kind of basic. And that's what you should be doing. And then also, too, Just one more without the brakes, whatever. Just you got this, and you're kind of hitting the outside of this. As we're coming through this, not only can we contour this, but we can get here and start thinking about drawing fish off of things. And I think which is important, which is, let's say this is topography, and that we'll just call this the bank, but these are some humps or bits. We're innately going to drive around. Hopefully we're thinking far enough advance. We're innately going to take our baits and drive around this contour line, right? Then we get here in this open water. So most anglers, what you're going to do, they'll come in here, they'll kind of hit this guy and do this, right? That's usually the path of travel. All right, kind of typical trolling. What I would recommend that we do, we'll kill that line, which is kind of your basic line, is consider, once we come over structure, major things of interest. Now this could be a crib, this could be a rock bar, a point, anything that is anomalous and structurally, or a weed bed, whatever, wherever you think a muskie is hiding or staged at that given moment. What we want to do is come through that area, but once we get out here, we want to start triggering things until we reach our next target, right? So let's say we have a target here and a target here. Those two lines. We know that X marks the spot, muskies mark the spot. I'm going to make sure I come through this, I'm going to turn with that brake line, and now I'm headed to my next place. What guys will do is you kind of get in this zombie mode where, especially the tighter things are together, you're focused here, now you have a following fish and don't know it, right? You came around this little point of this structure to this crib and you go, he didn't hit, and I keep going to this one and this one, this one. Everybody's done it. You have casting days where muskies just follow. They just follow and follow and follow. It happens trolling. So we need to consider, we're coming around structure on some of this stuff. Here's a crib, whatever. We come through this, we contour that guy. We come out here and we do something triggering, right? Once we've drawn this fish off of his cover or structure, right? So he's followed us. He's paying attention to us. What are we going to do now to trigger that fish? So not only have we made the turn, that is when we need to think about, are we going to slow things down where both baits float up and then surge them, right? Was something I like to do quite a bit, which is a trigger after we come through a major spot, right? So everyone has seen, and most people hopefully you've twitched a minnow bait, right? There's a little trick you can use. I'll grab this B&N claw here, great baits here. Still got the price tag. I go through these like crazy. They're wonderful baits. But here's a B&N claw, right? He's going to troll like this. But if I see that fish, he came off that piece of structure and he's just following Mr. Claw and I'm driving my boat straight, he could get bored, right? He could give up on the chase or on the follow. Before I make it to my next goal or my next kind of important spot during that trolling pass, once I hit that covering structure, I'm typically going to give it 2 to 3 line lengths, right? So we'll put his little cover back here. Here was his spot, and here's this whatever. He was here. And I'm trolling this way. You know, if I got 40 feet of line and I hit this guy, he comes off here and he follows, I'm going to advance probably about 40 more feet before I'm going to have to add something in there to trigger that strike, right? So we've contoured around this. And now our path of travel is this. What guys tend to do is they just end up doing that. So what we can do as far as our path of travel to break that from a follow into a strike is, again, the surging. I love to do it. I'll come off this. I'll go 40, 50, 60 feet from a positive structure or piece of cover straight into reverse. Or not reverse, excuse me, into neutral. Where this bait's traveling, say he's our 7, 8 feet mark, Mr. Muskie's on him. When I snap that boat into neutral, that bait's coming up, and then I'll go right back into my target speed, right? What that creates is a bait that's running at a very consistent depth, starts coming up, and you get it back down, right? And so now we're creating a different retrieve. So we engaged him on this very basic straight retrieve, and now we start adding in a triggering thing, right? Trigger. We want to work on a trigger after we hit our target goal, right? So what I'm focused on, more so than anything, is breaking down a contour, a shoreline, whatever, right? Let's just do one more of these. Where I'm identifying through seasonality, through patterning, through my electronics, a few key places muskies should be, right? So let's say they've kind of been on the break. Let's just call this like a 10-foot break, right? 10-foot break. And we know they're all kind of on that break. We might not know these fish are here exactly, but we've patterned based on bait fish, based on electronics or other success or failures on the water. We know they're at that 10-foot break. Really a high level of focus to make sure that we are doing everything we can after we hit these key spots. Now, let's say here, it's not very Northwoodsy, but whatever, or Canadian even. Let's say here's a tree, right? A lay down, right? This is my, I am a muskie guide, not an artist. So here's a lay down, and Mr. Muskie is here, right? And say up here, let's just call this a crib. There's cribs pretty much everywhere, so this little pathetic art is a crib. That focus becomes hitting that 10-foot mark on these, this is cover at this point. But after I pass this cover, I'm going to assume that I have a follow each and every time, which will really keep me from just kind of bopping, because people tend to go, oh, it came over the tree, he didn't hit it, and they just straight beeline for the next target, right? Now, some people are just out there zombie trawling and have no target at all, which I'd recommend that you focus on the structural elements and whatever the patterning is telling you. But make sure you come across this, he could be holding here. We come out here, we kind of have to cope with this turn. We're going to do some other things that mix things up throughout the entirety of our trolling, right? Now, there are certain baits that add to this. Now, you go, I talked earlier about wander, right? What does wander mean? Ivan baits wander. Supernatural baits wander. I'll grab this matlock. This goes back to triggering mechanisms and what can happen and what can do. So we talked about our grandma. Its path of travel going to be pretty straight, right? It's going to be a little bit of deviation, but if I'm trolling in this direction, let's say that's a grandma. So the boat's going this way. Grandma's going to stay pretty tight to that. When we talk about wander, we're looking for a side-to-side action. Now, this is something to consider when we're selecting baits as well, for the fatter, wider action, the more aggressive action. So a matlock, a headlock, an Ivan bait, there's a few other baits that have that innate wander to them. As you're trolling forward, they're going side to side, slightly up, slightly back down, and they're not running dead center to the rod tip. So that is something to look at if you're trolling areas in open water. Now, we were just talking about that triggering mechanism and what we're able to do around cover, around structure, and add those mid-cast triggers. You know, if you're out in the open basin, you know, you're out here and it's just like, you know, here it is, 20 feet all the way to the top. This is, you know, 20 feet, you know, just out of the middle of nowhere. And you got, you know, guys doing this crap they like to do sometimes. You know, you got muskies just spread out over everywhere. You know, you got them low, got them high, got them wherever. And they're suspended willy-nilly over this 20 feet zone. And we really don't have any target. Imagine that's just open base and we're not even targeting the bottom there. You know, a bait with that wide wander as we're advancing is actually going to pick up more fish, because at that point when we're in the open basin, of that nature, we're really not going to have any cues other than electronics to know exactly when we need to shake things up, juke and jive and change things up. So I really like to take advantage of the wander of supernatural big baits. And that, like I said, in that open water scenario, that really seems to help things out quite a bit to target more fish and pick up more fish there. So, you know, those are some key components of a trolling game plan to really get you started. Like I said, the hierarchy of line length and your speed and your distance. Obviously, the Musky 360 app has these trolling charts available with those line lengths for you. They're going to help you break down that dynamic and kind of unpack what you need to do and hit those target depths. Now, again, it's going to be up to you to determine based on seasonality how wide that bait action needs to be or how aggressive. But you really have a good parameter of your speeds. And it's something that people ask all the time. What are trolling speeds, right? To be honest with you, if a bait will run at it, that's as fast as it'll troll. But really, you know, 2 miles an hour to 5. I mean, that's kind of your main range. You know, most baits at 2 miles an hour, they're not going to have a tremendous amount of action. They're going to run shallow. And at 5 miles an hour, there's quite a bit of baits, quite a few baits that are not even going to run. They'll just kind of blow out. So, you know, most of your trolling, there's plenty of baits that can do slower or faster, but your real general, your real all year round trolling speeds really fall those high 2s to the mid 4s. And if you're a starting angler, you know, trolling, I would recommend, you know, 2.5, 4.5. That's going to be important for you to kind of be comfortable in that range, right? That's where my bread and butter is made, trolling, but that's a really safe zone there, right? Anything less, anything more, it convolutes things, but most of your baits are going to run kind of where you want them to be and be where you want them to be. Something to consider when we're trolling is going to be the right setup. You know, there's a lot to be said about that, and I'll grab this. Got a Musky Shop shield rod here with a line counter, right? So when it comes to trolling, our main thing is repeatability, right? The repeatability is what's important with trolling. So you need a line counter reel. You can do it with your casting rods or reels. There's nothing wrong with that. But a line counter is going to give you the repeatability you need, because again, if we know, you know, Mr. Musky's here at, you know, and the dynamic is this, Mr. Musky's here underwater, he's at 7.5 feet, right? Our bait's running whatever, our bait's running here at 6. And we got a strike. Well, if we were eyeballing it, could we possibly be running below where the fish are? So line counter, line counter, line counter, because you can always hit your depth. You can hit exact depths. If you're doing the same speed with the same bait with the exact same amount of line, it's going to be repeatable, continually repeatable. So it's super important. Also, too, good line clicker on there. So when that fish rips, drag. Something that comes up all the time, what rods to troll with. I'm going to show you. This is the Musky Shop Shield trolling rod. So this is the 8-foot model. What I like about this rod, it's got a pretty flexy tip, right? The very end of this thing backbones up right about here. What I like about this rod, it is soft enough at the tip that I can really have my drag set kind of tight, right? You'll hear a lot of schools of thought on drag when it comes to musky trolling. I like to have it moderately tight. I don't want it to go zinging every time a fish hits. I want to use that softer rod tip as a snubber or a buffer for those strikes before my drag pulls, right? So that's why I like the softer rod tip that kind of ends with a tight backbone there, where the fish is really not going to be able to shake it, right? And when it comes to catching them, trolling, you got to realize there's kind of a trick there of how to land one trolling, right? You know, we end up here and we're hooked up, whatever. I just like drawing on this thing, sorry. So we're hooked up, we got a bait in him. When he pulls the drag, zzz, 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 right? He's hooked up. And we slam our boat in neutral, we still have advance. We're still advancing. Right? So if you're doing 4.5 miles an hour and a fish hits, you hit it in neutral, you're still going to careen forward for a while, right? So that's something to consider when you're setting your drag, because you have forward pressure, you have the soft rod tip, but we still have pressure on that fish because you go into neutral when the fish hits, it's going forward, right? So we want to make sure our drag will pull enough that he's not going to snap off or anything of that nature. But, you know, take in consideration when you're setting that it is going to still be going after that fish hits and you slam it into neutral. Now, I've had a lot of people ask about that, and I've heard old school guys would just, you know, keep the motor in low gear with a fish on. I think that's really old school with the mono. I always go to neutral. One thing I would say, we'll do top down real quick. You know, if I'm here and we got 2 lines out and he hits this one, right? So we're trolling, we're going in this direction and this fish hits, we're headed this way. And we get a strike on this side. I'll typically, once I'll slam it in neutral, I'll kind of turn the wheel this way. So as I advance, it'll slacken the pressure on him a little bit, right? So I try to turn into the fish. I don't want to turn away from him to bring the bait in that way, but I typically will, if I get hit saying I'm headed this straight, I'll turn into the fish when I hit. So neutral, turn the wheel hard that way. The boat will kind of careen that way, take a little bit of pressure off him. And that typically tends to help with a big fish. And there's nothing wrong with hand holding a bait or a rod. But if you're going to get serious about trolling, there's a couple things I recommend. I've pulled one of these off the boat. This is a Folby rod holder, and Jay can show you in a clip here of how easy it is to pull the rods out of these, right? So with this Folby, it just clips in your boat. Something you want to take note of, it opens on one side. So we always want to face the unopening side towards the back of the boat, right? We don't want this side to open up. You know, it could, it's not going to, but I like to have that side towards the back of the boat. So when we lock a rod into this guy, all we got to do is lift straight up. There's no forward and out or anything of that nature. So a good setup. Now, when it comes to a good setup on a trolling rig, you know, if you are relegated to just a singular rod, it doesn't matter what you do. Right, but let's say you can do 2 rods, 1 angler, 2 rods. Right, so you're typically driving over here, driving in the center. When I am trolling and I only have 2 rods, I'm going to make sure that I rig my boat with the rods in the back corner, right? This is typically the most responsive, right? So it's kind of instantly responsive as we turn the boat and we do different things. So if you're only relegated to 2 rods, I'm going to go here. If I can pick, say, 3 rods, I'm going to do that prop wash rod, right? Which there's a lot of ways to do it, and I'm sure there's some video clips of me running on prop wash. But, you know, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3. If we can do more than that, we're going to advance up the boat, right? And this is kind of what I run. That's my max. I have no restrictions where I'm at. I'll typically run that, and then on crazy days this, right? And so you can rig a boat for that. Now it becomes a matter of, yeah, we got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? So we got 2 down rods of prop wash rods and 3 coming off the side. Typically, I mean, I have to be just feeling insane to do that. This is kind of like my typical max, what I'm comfortable running, right? So what you end up with is your lines, these are kind of straight backs, right? And it's very easy if you're using like the Musky Shop Shield trolling rods, you've got 8 feet of width coming off your rod holder, about 7.5, whatever. It's spreading the baits out quite a bit there off the back. But if we're going to run rods stacked this way, right? And like I said, if you're running 1 rod, 2 rods, run them off the back corner. There's your primary rods. These are if you're going to load one up, those are the first ones to get loaded up. But let's say I want to run 4. We need planer boards, right? So what does a planer board do? I'll grab one here. This is the blade. These are some final prototypes from Livingston Lures. This was something we were custom making, Josh Hackensmith and myself, for quite some time. Just couldn't keep up with them. And so Livingston's making these. These are the blade. They'll pull anything. But let's say I'm going to set up a planer board, right? First and foremost, when do we set them up, right? So we don't want to set baits here and then walk up to the front of the boat and then try to feed this rod at the rod tip and out here and we're going to have a tangle, right? So if we're going to run a spread of planer boards, we need to go like this. We need to set these rods out first with our planer boards. Now what a planer board does, running in this direction, it picks up water and it will take it away from your boat, right? So we have a left and a right. And so these blades will get these baits away from your boat, okay? So if I'm setting up this spread of planer boards, I want to do my planer board setups first, right? So if you're doing, let's say we're doing 2 sets of planer boards and you're a crazy person like I am, we're going to do 2 sets of boards. Outsides first. So anything that's on the outside of my trolling spread, The further forward in the boat, these are first. So this is first, second, right, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. As far as my hierarchy of setting up, right, it's pretty of what I want to do, because if not, you're going to get into a mess, right? That's just a recipe for disaster. You could theoretically, like I said, if you want to set these guys up first, they're not going to be in any way. If you're running any of those, like I said, set these forehand ones up first and get that spread out here, right? And the question when it comes to planer boards quite a bit is how far out do I want them? All right, so the blade will do just about anything reasonable as far as distance from the boat. But back to this deal, right? What can we use a planer board for anyway? So we got this, and it's rocks. These are, wow, should have been an artist, everybody. Should have been an artist, right? So here's rocks, whatever. Bad stuff. No, we don't want to get our boat into this, and there's rocks out here, and rocky, craggy, awful. We can actually use a planer board with a singular line to come up far off of this, have a planer board running off this guy, and run our bait in really craggy places we don't want to be, right? Say that rocks, we're really thinking about this guy. Here's really bad rock, right? Everybody's got it on their boat or on the thing. I can use a planer board to run past really bad rock. That's not a problem, right? So I'm not worried about trying to troll this bait in here and I got to run her across really bad rock. I can use a planer board to actually space a singular bait out and get it in places I don't want to run my outboard, right? So trolling Canada, trolling some of the stuff, you know, Shield Lakes are notoriously rocky, things of that nature, or if timber, you know, if there's places that you're suspect of where you want to be. Now, you know, most people will just use that as a singular, as just to spread out more lines. But like I said, that can be deadly with a product like the Blade Planer Board to get that bait in places you don't want to drive your boat. Like I said, the timber and the rocks. Also, too, with planer boards, there is a value for pressured water, right? And so if there's a lot of lakes where I just call them trolling lakes. Everybody knows, you know, the muskies are pretty susceptible to trolling. Say they're open water fish. You can create, you know, here's Mr. Muskie on said whatever. Here's a big old weed bed. You know, here's just open water weed bed with clearance on it. You know, everybody and their brother just runs up through it. You can actually do some damage and actually give a different kind of viewpoint to the muskies by using a planer board to hit, you know, deep weeds or run over this as you advance where you're keeping your boat out of the equation. Right? And so it's a little stealthier. So I like to use planer boards, like I said, if I'm using multiple baits and I can spread them out and I'm in a place where it's legal to use as many baits as I want, I'm in. Like I said, if I'm dealing with places I don't want to drive my outboard through or my tiller through, I'm in. And if I need an element of stealth, that can be highly important. You know, when it comes to trolling, there's so much to cover. There's so much to talk about. You know, I really hope some of this helps dial you in a little bit. The guys at the Musky Shop, the staff at the Musky Shop are super knowledgeable and they're going to help you guys out. Anytime you call, anytime you email, anytime you message the app, everybody at the Musky Shop knows how to troll. Jim Stewart's one of the best trollers I ever met. They will be able to help you guys out, get you dialed in, and put you more muskies in the net with dialed in trolling from the Musky Shop.